Harlem in those years did not sleep, it endured. The streets carried more than footsteps. They carried memory, pressure, and the quiet understanding that survival required more than strength. It required restraint. It required awareness. And sometimes it required silence so powerful it could stop a storm before it ever broke. In a world where loud men often rose quickly and fell even faster, there existed a different kind of figure, one who did not chase attention, did not demand recognition, and yet somehow stood at the center of everything that mattered. That man was Bumpy Johnson. He was not the kind of man people described with exaggeration. No one needed to. His presence spoke clearly enough on its own. He walked with the kind of calm that suggested he had already measured every room before entering it, every outcome before a word was spoken. There was no rush in him, no unnecessary motion. His strength was not in volume or display, it was in certainty. And that certainty had been shaped not by comfort, but by a lifetime of watching how quickly dignity could be taken from those who didn't protect it. The city around him was not kind. It had never been. Harlem, vibrant as it was with culture and resilience, existed under a constant weight of limitation, of judgment, of forces that operated beyond fairness. Opportunities were uneven, respect was conditional, and justice often seemed like something reserved for others. But within that imbalance, there were men who adapted, men who resisted, and men who chose a different path altogether. Bumpy Johnson was one of the few who understood that true power did not come from reacting to the world as it was, but from deciding how you would exist within it. Before the name carried weight, before whispers followed his movements, he was simply a man who observed. He learned early that anger, while justified, was often used against those who carried it openly. He saw how men were provoked, pushed, and then punished for responding exactly as expected. And so he made a choice, not to ignore injustice, but to approach it differently. To never give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. To never allow his dignity to be dictated by someone else's behavior. That philosophy was not built overnight. It was earned through moments most people would prefer to forget. Encounters where respect was denied not because of who he was, but because of what others decided he represented. Situations where silence was mistaken for weakness until it wasn't, and over time, those moments shaped him into something rare, a man who could stand in the face of pressure without becoming part of it. It was this reputation, quiet as it was, that began to travel. Not loudly, not recklessly, but steadily. People spoke about him in a way that suggested more than admiration, it suggested trust. Shop owners knew that when Bumpy Johnson gave his word, it held. Families knew that he carried himself with a kind of respect that extended beyond business or territory. And even those who did not fully understand him recognized that there was something different in the way he operated. He did not chase control, he maintained balance. But balance, in a city like New York during that era, was never left undisturbed for long. Beyond Harlem, in offices where decisions were made without ever setting foot on those streets, men like Lucky Luciano had built systems of influence that extended into every corner of the city. Their power was not just in numbers or resources, it was in structure, in organization, in the ability to shape outcomes before others even realized they were part of a game. And within that structure, Harlem was often viewed not as a community, but as an opportunity, a place to expand, to control, to profit from without truly understanding the people who lived there. For a time, those worlds remained separate enough to avoid direct conflict. But separation, in a city constantly shifting, is never permanent. The first signs were subtle. New faces appearing where familiar ones had always stood. Conversations that used to happen openly becoming quieter, more cautious. Small changes that, on their own, meant very little but together began to form a pattern. And Bumpy noticed. Of course he did. He always noticed. He didn't react immediately. That wasn't his way. Instead, he observed. He listened more than he spoke. He allowed the situation to reveal itself fully before deciding how to move within it. Because reacting too soon could mean playing into someone else's strategy, and Bumpy Johnson had no interest in being controlled by anyone's design. It was during one of those observations that he first encountered Dutch Schultz. Dutch was everything Bumpy was not, at least on the surface. Where Bumpy was composed, Dutch was expressive. Where Bumpy measured his words, Dutch used them freely. But beneath that difference, there was something else. A kind of awareness that most people overlooked. Dutch Schultz was not careless. He was deliberate in his own way. And more importantly, he understood power not just how to use it, but how to recognize it in others. Their first interaction was not dramatic. It didn't need to be. It happened in a setting where tension was already present, where expectations had been formed before either man spoke. Dutch had come with a purpose to establish presence, to make it clear that Harlem was no longer outside the reach of larger forces, and Bumpy, as always, was simply there. Not to challenge, not to submit, but to exist on his own terms. When they spoke, it wasn't loud, it wasn't confrontational. It was something far more complex, a conversation where every word carried weight, where meaning existed not just in what was said, but in what was left unsaid. Dutch tested him in small ways, not with direct threats, but with implications. Suggestions of how things could change, how arrangements could be made, how cooperation could benefit everyone involved. It was the language of power, polished, controlled, and designed to sound reasonable even when it wasn't. And Bumpy listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't dismiss. He allowed Dutch to finish, to fully express his position. And then, when the moment came for him to respond, he did so in a way that shifted the entire dynamic of the conversation. He didn't argue. He didn't resist in the way Dutch expected. Instead, he acknowledged the reality of the situation, calmly, clearly, without fear. And then he did something far more significant. He defined his own position within it. He made it clear, without raising his voice, that while he understood the forces at play, he would not be moved by them. That respect for him was not something negotiated under pressure. That any arrangement would have to be built on mutual understanding, not control. It was not a refusal. But it was not acceptance either. It was something in between, a line drawn so precisely that crossing it would require intention. And for the first time, Dutch Schultz paused. Not because he was unsure of his own power, but because he recognized something in Bumpy that did not fit into the usual patterns. This was not a man who could be easily pressured or persuaded. Not because he was defiant, but because he was grounded in a way that made external pressure less effective. The conversation ended without resolution. But it did not end without impact, because from that moment forward, Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a presence in Harlem. He was a consideration. And in a world where most people were treated as pieces on a board, being a consideration meant something very different. It meant that decisions involving Harlem would no longer be made without accounting for him. It meant that his silence, his restraint, his refusal to be pulled into unnecessary conflict was not weakness. It was strategy. And as the days passed, as the tension between those two worlds continued to build, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not going to be a conflict decided by force. It was going to be decided by who understood the value of control, not over others, but over themselves. And in that arena, Bumpy Johnson was already ahead. True power begins the moment a man refuses to be controlled by anyone but himself. The days that followed that first meeting did not explode into chaos as many had expected. Instead, they settled into something far more dangerous, and uneasy quiet that stretched across Harlem like a held breath. Nothing obvious had changed, and yet everything felt different. Conversations lowered in tone when certain names were mentioned. Footsteps slowed near certain corners, And men who once spoke with certainty now measured their words more carefully. It was not fear in the traditional sense, but awareness, the kind that comes when people understand that forces beyond their control have begun to move. Bumpy Johnson noticed it all, not because he was searching for it, but because he had always paid attention to the things others overlooked. Harlem had its own rhythm, a pulse that could not be faked or forced, and when that rhythm shifted, even slightly, he felt it immediately. The laughter in the evening was shorter. The glances between neighbors were sharper. The space between what was said and what was meant had grown wider. And within that space, tension began to live. He did not rush to respond. He never did. Instead, he moved as he always had, steady, composed, deliberate. He greeted people the same way, carried himself with the same quiet authority, and refused to let the atmosphere dictate his behavior. Because he understood something many did not. Once you allow pressure to change you, even in small ways, you begin to lose ground you may never recover. But elsewhere in the city, patience was not being mistaken for strength. In rooms far removed from Harlem's streets, where polished tables replaced worn sidewalks and decisions were made without ever hearing the voices they affected, Bumpy Johnson had become more than a curiosity. He had become a question. And questions in that world demanded answers. Lucky Luciano did not operate on impulse. His power came from structure, from order, from understanding how to maintain control without appearing to force it. But even he recognized when something or someone did not fit neatly into that order. Reports had reached him, not exaggerated or dramatic, but consistent. They all described the same thing: a man who could not be pressured in the usual ways, who did not respond to intimidation as expected, and who, perhaps most concerning of all, seemed to influence others without ever needing to prove himself. That kind of presence was not easily dismissed. And so, a decision was made not out of anger, but out of necessity. If Bumpy Johnson could not be understood from a distance, then he would be understood up close. The message did not arrive in words, it arrived in movement. It was late afternoon when it happened, the kind of hour when the day begins to soften. But the night has not yet taken hold. Harlem was alive in its usual way, vendors calling out, music drifting faintly from open windows, the steady rhythm of a community continuing despite everything that pressed against it. And within that rhythm, Bumpy walked as he always did, his presence neither announced nor hidden. But something was different. Not immediately visible, not obvious enough to alarm, but there. A subtle tightening of space. A shift in the way people moved around him. The kind of change that could easily go unnoticed by anyone not trained to see it. Bumpy noticed, and he kept walking. The first man appeared from the left, not abruptly, but with intention. His pace matched Bumpy's for a moment, before slowing just enough to fall slightly behind. Then another, from the opposite side, mirroring the movement with equal precision. Within seconds, the pattern completed itself. 3 more figures, positioned just close enough to define a boundary without closing it completely. It was not a confrontation yet. It was a formation. And in that formation, the message was clear: Bumpy stopped. Not because he was forced to, but because he chose to. The street did not freeze, but it changed. Conversations dimmed. Eyes shifted away. The unspoken understanding passed quickly. Something significant was happening, and it was not something to be witnessed too closely. The men surrounding him were calm, controlled, their expressions carefully neutral. They were not reckless individuals looking for a scene. They were deliberate, trained in their own way to apply pressure without chaos. And though their weapons were not drawn openly, their presence was unmistakable, resting just beneath the surface, ready, implied rather than displayed. One of them stepped forward. He was not loud. He did not need to be. His voice carried just enough weight to be heard without drawing attention beyond the immediate circle. His words were measured, chosen carefully, framed not as a threat, but as a statement of reality. He spoke of structure, of order, of how things were meant to operate. He spoke as though explaining something simple, something inevitable. And through it all, Bumpy Johnson listened. He did not interrupt. He did not react. His face remained composed, his posture unchanged, as though the pressure surrounding him had no authority over how he chose to stand. When the man finished, there was a pause. It was brief, but it carried weight. Because this was the moment where most men made a choice driven by instinct. They either resisted openly, escalating the situation, or they submitted quietly, allowing the pressure to achieve its purpose. Bumpy did neither. Instead, he took a slow breath, not exaggerated, not performative, just natural, and allowed the silence to settle fully before he spoke. And when he did, his voice was calm, not cold, not defiant, just steady. He acknowledged what had been said, not in agreement, but in understanding. He made it clear that he recognized the structure they described, the system they represented. But then, with a clarity that could not be misunderstood, he shifted the ground beneath their feet. He spoke of respect, not as something given out of fear, but as something earned through consistency. He spoke of presence, not as something imposed, but as something built over time. And most importantly, he spoke of Harlem not as territory, but as a community that could not be managed like a ledger. There were no threats in his words, no raised tone, no challenge issued. And yet, something in what he said disrupted the balance, because he was not rejecting them. He was redefining the conversation. The man in front of him hesitated. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. A moment where the expected response did not arrive, where the script they had prepared no longer applied. Another man shifted slightly, his stance adjusting as though preparing for a different outcome. But even that movement lacked certainty. Because Bumpy Johnson had not given them a reason to act, he had not escalated. He had not disrespected. He had simply stood completely, undeniably on his own terms. Then came the moment no one expected. Bumpy stepped forward. Just one step, measured, controlled. And in that step he closed the distance not with aggression, but with presence. It was not an advance, it was a declaration. A quiet statement that he was not contained by the circle they had formed. The air tightened. For a brief second, everything seemed to hold. Because now, the choice was no longer his, it was theirs. And suddenly, the situation they had constructed began to feel uncertain. To escalate now would require justification something he had not given them. To retreat would mean acknowledging that their presence had not achieved its intended effect. And in that hesitation, the power shifted. Not dramatically, not permanently, but enough. The man who had spoken first exhaled slowly, his expression remaining controlled, but his posture softening just slightly. He understood what had happened, even if he could not openly acknowledge it. This was not a man who could be handled in the usual ways. And forcing the situation further would not guarantee the outcome they wanted. One by one, the formation loosened. A step back here, a shift in position there. Nothing obvious enough to appear like retreat, but enough to change the shape of the moment. Bumpy did not move again. He did not press forward. He did not speak further. He simply remained where he was, allowing the silence to complete what his words had begun. And eventually, the men stepped away, not defeated, not humiliated, but changed. Because they had come to impose something, and had instead encountered something they could not impose upon. As the space around him opened, as the street slowly returned to its rhythm, Bumpy adjusted his coat slightly and continued walking, his pace unchanged, his expression as calm as it had been before any of it began. But behind him, and far beyond that street, the impact of that moment began to travel. Not as a story of conflict, but as something far more powerful. A story of control, of restraint, of a man who stood in the center of pressure and did not bend, not because he resisted force, but because he never gave it power to begin with. And somewhere in a room where decisions were made carefully and reputations carried weight, that story would reach the ears of a man who understood exactly what it meant. Because sometimes the most dangerous opponent is not the one who fights back, but the one who never needs to fight at all. Power shifts the moment fear finds nothing to hold on to. By the time the story reached the men who truly shaped the city, it had already begun to evolve. Not in facts, those remained simple, almost uneventful, but in meaning. Because what happened on that Harlem street was not dramatic in the way most expected power to reveal itself. There had been no shouting, no visible struggle, no moment of collapse or surrender. And yet, those who understood influence recognized something far more significant had taken place. A line had been tested, and it had not moved. In the days that followed, Harlem did not erupt. It did something more unsettling. It remained steady. No retaliation came, no signs of weakness appeared. Businesses continued, conversations resumed, and the quiet dignity that defined the community held its ground. But beneath that surface, something had changed in the way people carried themselves. Not loudly, not recklessly, but with a subtle shift that could only be described as awareness of their own worth. And that shift did not go unnoticed elsewhere. Behind closed doors where the atmosphere was carefully controlled and every word was measured before being spoken, the conversation had already begun. Lucky Luciano did not rely on rumors. He listened, analyzed, and decided only when the full shape of a situation revealed itself. The reports placed before him were consistent, each one describing the same moment from different angles, each one arriving at the same quiet conclusion. Bumpy Johnson had not resisted. He had not submitted. He had simply remained. And that, more than anything else, complicated the matter. Because force works best when it is met with force. It creates clarity. It defines sides. It allows outcomes to be predicted. But when force meets composure, true composure, not hesitation, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty, in a system built on control, is something that cannot be ignored. Luciano understood this. He leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. Not irritated, not threatened, just attentive. Because this was not a situation that called for reaction. It called for understanding. And understanding required something different. A meeting. Not a public one. Not one designed to intimidate or display power, but one that would reveal what kind of man Bumpy Johnson truly was. The invitation did not arrive in writing, nor was it delivered with urgency. It came through a quiet channel, a message passed carefully, without pressure but with clear intention. The location was chosen deliberately, not in Harlem, and not in the open spaces where eyes could watch and assumptions could form. It was a place where conversations carried weight, where silence meant as much as speech. When Bumpy received the message, he did not respond immediately. He let it sit. Not out of hesitation, but out of principle. Because responding too quickly would suggest eagerness. Ignoring it would suggest avoidance. And Bumpy Johnson was neither eager nor avoidant. He was deliberate. So when he finally accepted, it was done in the same manner he approached everything else, quietly, without ceremony, and entirely on his own terms. The night of the meeting arrived without announcement. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside, its presence blending into the city as though it had no significance at all. But inside, the air was different, controlled, intentional. Every detail arranged not for comfort, but for clarity. Bumpy entered alone, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The room he stepped into was not large, but it did not need to be. Its purpose was not to impress, it was to contain. At the far end, seated with the kind of composure that comes from years of understanding how to command a space without dominating it, was Lucky Luciano. Their eyes met. And in that moment, before a single word was spoken, something passed between them. Recognition, not of friendship, not of alliance, but of understanding. Luciano gestured slightly, an invitation rather than an instruction. Bumpy took his seat. The silence that followed was not awkward, it was deliberate. A pause designed to observe, to measure, to allow each man to understand the other without interference. Luciano spoke first. His voice was calm, controlled, carrying. The kind of authority that did not need reinforcement. He did not reference the street directly. He did not accuse or question. Instead, he spoke in broader terms, about structure, about order, about how a city like New York required balance to function. It was not a speech, it was a test. Bumpy listened, as always. And when Luciano finished, when the room settled into that familiar, weighted silence, Bumpy responded. He did not mirror Luciano's words. He did not challenge them. He simply reframed them. He spoke of the same city, but from a different perspective. Not from above, but from within. He spoke of people, not systems. Of trust, not control. Of how order, when imposed without understanding, does not create stability, it creates resistance. There was no edge in his tone, no defiance, just clarity. And once again, the conversation shifted. Luciano leaned forward slightly, his interest no longer concealed. Because what sat across from him was not a man opposing his influence, nor a man submitting to it. It was something far more complex. A man who could not be easily placed. The discussion continued, moving deeper, not louder. Each word carried weight, each pause held meaning. There were moments where the space between them seemed to tighten, where a single misplaced tone could have changed everything. But neither man allowed that to happen. Because both understood something essential. This was not about winning. It was about defining. At one point, Luciano allowed a question to surface, not direct, not confrontational, but precise enough to matter. He asked what Bumpy intended to do, given the realities of the situation. It was a simple question. But it carried expectation. Most men, in that moment, would outline a plan, make a case, attempt to justify their position. Bumpy did something different. He paused, not long, just enough. And then he answered in a way that did not fit expectation at all. He did not speak of intentions, he spoke of principles. He made it clear that his actions would not be guided by pressure, nor shaped by fear. That whatever came next would not be a reaction, but a continuation of who he already was. There was no negotiation in his words, but there was no rejection either. And in that space between those two things, something settled. Luciano sat back again, his expression unreadable to anyone who did not understand him. But beneath that stillness, a decision was forming, because what he saw was not opposition. It was stability. And stability, when it cannot be controlled, can sometimes be more valuable when it is respected. The room grew quiet again, longer this time. And then, without announcement, Luciano gave a slight nod. It was not dramatic. It was not explained, but it was understood. The meeting was over. Not because it had failed, but because it had reached its conclusion. Bumpy rose. He did not rush. He did not linger. He simply acknowledged the moment in the only way he ever did, through presence, not performance. And as he turned to leave, Luciano spoke once more, not loudly, not as a command, but as a statement. He acknowledged Bumpy not as a subordinate, not as an adversary, but as something else entirely. A man who understood the weight of his own ground. Bumpy did not respond with words. He didn't need to. He left the room the same way he had. Entered it calm, composed, unchanged. But the air behind him was different. Because in that room, something had shifted. Not in territory, not in power structures, but in recognition. And sometimes, recognition is the beginning of a new kind of order. Outside, the city continued as it always had, unaware, unchanged in its movement. But within the spaces where decisions mattered, where influence was measured not by noise, but by outcome, the understanding had settled. Bumpy Johnson was not a man to be moved. He was a man to be accounted for. And from that moment on, every decision involving Harlem would carry that truth within it. Because power does not always change hands through force. Sometimes, it changes the moment one man refuses to let it be taken at all. Respect begins where control no longer works. The city did not announce the change. There were no headlines, no public acknowledgments, no grand gestures that marked the moment when something unseen settled into place. New York continued as it always had, restless, layered, indifferent on the surface. But beneath that constant motion, in the spaces where influence moved quietly and decisions shaped lives without ever being spoken aloud, something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. And Harlem felt it first, not as relief, not as victory, but as a return to something steadier. The tension that had once lingered in every corner did not disappear entirely, but it softened. Conversations regained their rhythm. Shop doors stayed open a little longer. People moved with less hesitation, not because danger had vanished, but because something had changed in how that danger behaved. It was no longer unpredictable. It was no longer pressing without understanding. And at the center of that shift, without claiming it, without even acknowledging it, was Bumpy Johnson. He did not walk differently. He did not speak more. He did not allow what had happened in that private room to alter the way he carried himself, because for him, nothing had changed. He had not fought for recognition. He had not sought approval. He had simply remained consistent, and consistency, over time, had done what force could not. But while Harlem adjusted quietly, elsewhere, not everyone accepted the new balance. Because power, once challenged even subtly, does not settle easily in every hand that once held it. There were men, not many but enough, who saw the shift not as a resolution, but as a disruption. To them, the idea that a man could stand without bending, could influence outcomes without force, was not admirable, it was dangerous. Because it suggested that control was not absolute. That structure, no matter how carefully built, had limits. And limits were not something they were willing to accept. The move they made was not sanctioned. It was not part of any larger plan. It was born from something far less controlled: ego, frustration, and the need to prove that power still belonged where they believed it should. It began quietly, a message intercepted, a delivery delayed. Small disruptions that on their own meant very little. But together, they formed a pattern, one designed not to confront Bumpy directly, but to destabilize the environment around him, to create pressure without a visible source, to force a reaction. And for a time it worked, not in breaking anything, but in testing. People began to notice the inconsistencies, the slight returns of uncertainty, the subtle reminders that the balance they felt might not be as stable as it seemed. Questions arose, not spoken openly, but present in the way people looked at one another, in the way conversations paused before continuing. And once again, all eyes turned not outward, but inward, toward the man who had never claimed to lead, but had become the center of stability regardless. Bumpy Johnson saw it, of course he did. But this time, he did not wait as long, because this was different. This was not a question of power, it was a question of trust. And trust, once shaken, required something more than silence. The moment came not in the open streets, but in a place far less visible. A back room, modest, unremarkable, chosen not for status but for purpose. The men responsible for the disruption had gathered there, confident in the belief that their actions had gone unnoticed, or at least unchallenged. They spoke freely, too freely, because they believed the absence of response meant absence of awareness, And then the door opened. No force, no sudden movement. Just a quiet interruption. Bumpy stepped inside, alone. The room changed immediately, not in sound, but in presence. Conversations stopped not because they were commanded to, but because something in the air no longer allowed them to continue. The men turned, one by one, their expressions shifting from certainty to something far less defined. Bumpy closed the door behind him, gently. And for a moment he said nothing. He let the silence settle, not as intimidation, but as clarity. Because in silence there is no distraction, no place to hide behind words or reactions. Only truth waiting to be acknowledged. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. Not sharp, not raised, just clear. He did not accuse them. He did not list what they had done. He spoke instead about consequence, not as punishment, but as reality. He spoke about how actions, even small ones, ripple outward. How instability does not stay contained. How when balance is disrupted, it is not just individuals who are affected, it is everyone. There was no anger in his tone, only certainty. And that certainty carried more weight than any threat could have. One of the men attempted to respond, his voice carrying a trace of defensiveness, of justification. But even as he spoke, it became clear that the words did not hold. Because Bumpy was not arguing with them, he was showing them what they already knew but had chosen to ignore. That their actions had not created strength, they had created risk. And risk, in a world where stability is everything, is the one thing no one can afford. Then came the turning point. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. Bumpy took a single step forward, just enough to close the space between them, and place something on the table. It was not money, not a weapon, not anything that demanded attention at first glance. It was a list, names, places, details, every action they had taken, documented not with accusation, but with precision. And he said only a few words. Not many, just enough. Enough to make it clear that nothing they had done had gone unseen. Enough to make it clear that he had not come to threaten them, but to give them a choice. Not between submission and resistance, but between understanding and consequence. The room fell into a deeper silence. Because in that moment, the illusion, they had been operating under the belief that they could act without being accounted for, collapsed entirely. They were not being confronted by force. They were being confronted by awareness, and awareness leaves no room for denial. No one spoke, no one moved, because there was nothing to say that would change what had already been revealed. And Bumpy did not wait for a response. He had not come for one. He let the silence complete the moment, allowed the weight of it to settle fully, and then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. He paused only once, not to look back, but to leave them with something they would not forget. A single sentence, quiet, measured, final, and then he left. The door closed as softly as it had opened, but the impact of what had happened remained. Because those men understood something now that they had not understood before. Power was not what they thought it was. It was not in control, not in disruption, not in force. It was in the ability to see clearly, act precisely, and leave no room for chaos to take hold. In the days that followed, the disruption stopped completely, not because they were forced to, but because they were understood, and that understanding spread. Not through orders, not through fear, but through quiet acknowledgement. Harlem returned to its rhythm fully, now not because it had been protected, but because it had been respected. And at the center of it all, Bumpy Johnson remained exactly as he had always been, unchanged, unmoved, a man who needed to raise his voice, because he had already learned how to be heard without it. And in the end, the city did not remember the tension or the men who tried to disrupt it. It remembered something else entirely. The moment when silence became stronger than force. The moment when dignity held its ground and refused to be shaken. The moment when one man proved that true power does not demand attention, it earns understanding. In the end, they didn't step back because they were forced to. They stepped back because they finally understood.